So after World War II, this is Churchill. I put a picture of him on here because of his Iron Curtain speech that he's going to give. Um, this one right here is a picture of the Berlin Wall, and then there's like little kids over here like running down the side of it. Um, and then over here are just some pictures of some pictures from the Korean War. So, moving on. So, aftermath of World War II. Um, once World War II ends, there will be many effects. The United States and the Soviet Union will both rise as world powers and competitors. After World War II, nations will begin to rebuild after the massive destruction that was done. Most of Asia and Europe laid in ruins. The population will take a detrimental hit, and a post-war economic boom will begin to bounce nations back. So these two pictures here are some rubble left over from World War II, kind of looked like that. And then over here we have some immediate effects of World War II. So one is going to be deaths, both military and civilian. Destruction. Many countries are going to need to rebuild from war and bombings. Debt. So lots of spending during World War II. Desire for peace led to creation of the United Nations and decolonization. So many countries are going to gain their independence. Um, After World War II, so huge portions of Asia will be reduced to rubble. Allies will begin occupying Germany and Japan. Um, the trials will begin to take place, and what I meant by that was the Nuremberg trials. Um, the United Nations decisions will lead to long-lasting issues. The United Nations partition for Palestine is going to happen. Growing tension between Western powers and Soviet Union. Um, German denazification, decolonization, and Germany is going to be divided. And we'll get into a little bit more of that as we go on. So World War II is going to be the most devastating in history. Approximately 50 to 80 million will perish, including 6 million Jews. Millions more will be injured or lose their homes or property. So, World War II, borders will be drawn and burials of the fallen would begin. 50 to 80 million would die during World War II. About 4% of the population will be killed. A large quantity of them will be Soviets. The process of burial is going to be really extensive. Because, like, you gotta find everybody and find their families and all that. So, the Allied forces will begin to occupy Japan and Germany, and also much of the territory they had gained during the war. The Allied forces will also work hard to permanently dismantle the nations that were a part of the Axis. Their factories will be destroyed, and former leaders would be taken out of power and tried for any wartime crimes that may have been committed. Wartime trials took place in Europe and Asia, which led to many executions and lengthy prison sentences. The process will also be an extensive one. Many Germans and Japanese people were uprooted from places that were home to them. United Nations decisions and the Allied powers occupying certain places would lead to long-lasting issues for the future. Tensions will reach a high, and East and West Germany would be created. The decisions will also lead to the creation of North and South Korea and the Korean War, which we'll also get into a little bit later. The United Nations partition plan for Palestine is going to lead to Israel declaring independence in 1948. This is going to lead to the ongoing Arab-Israeli conflict. The Cold War is going to develop. Along with the Cold War, the nuclear arms race would begin. This made the possibility of World War III very real if they did not find a solution. The Allies would put a program in place to begin denazifying Germany, and Germany will be divided and controlled by the Allied parties. The legacy of the war includes the spread of communism from Soviet Union into Eastern Europe, and eventually it will make it to China and be successful. Power is going to shift from Europe into the hands of the two superpowers, who were the United States and the Soviet Union, who will clash when the Cold War begins. So I have a small video here that's just going to go a little bit more in depth about it.
This war left many countries devastated and influenced generations of life. Welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we'll take a look at the aftermath of World War II. The atomic bombing of Japan brutally forced that country's surrender and brought the Second World War to an end. However, the end of battle left much of Europe in ruins, both physically and economically. Plus, tensions remained between the Axis and Allied countries for years due to divergent belief systems. In terms of lives lost, the Second World War was the deadliest war in history. Between 50 and 70 million people were killed, and a large portion of these were civilians. The Holocaust saw an estimated 6 million European Jews perish at the hands of the Nazis, and this comprised over 1/3 of the world's Jewish population at the time. Many other marginalized groups were also targeted by the Nazis, including Poles, homosexuals, and disabled peoples. Many of those who did survive were left without homes. Also, new borders were drawn throughout Europe and Asia that created a new geopolitical landscape. Europe's overall weakness led to decolonization, and countries like India and Pakistan gained independence from the British Empire. World power shifted from Europe at this point as well to the United States and the Soviet Union. In fact, the aftermath of war greatly affected the Soviet Union. It is approximated that over 25 million Soviets died in the battle, and only half of these were military deaths. It eventually took 30 years for the population to return to pre-war numbers. Tensions between the Soviets and the Western Allies surfaced, despite the fact they had fought together. Even before fighting ended, the suggestion was made that war between the United States and the Soviet Union was unavoidable, and that capitalist and communist systems could not coexist. This led to the symbolic Iron Curtain between Eastern and Western Europe. In 1946, the Cold War between communist Soviet forces and the Western world began, and was only resolved in 1989. Meanwhile, Germany was forced to pay reparations and to cede territorial gains the country had made during the war. The Germans were also left to rebuild their nation without aid. Things were similarly bleak in Japan, though the Japanese were also struggling with the consequences of the nuclear bombings. Remaining Nazi leaders were prosecuted by the International Military Tribunal, or IMT, a few months after fighting ceased in the Nuremberg trials. Prior to this, the act of waging war had not been punishable by law. However, the brutality and extremity of the Nazis' actions convinced the Allies to indict those responsible. The trials lasted from November 20th, 1945 to October 1st, 1946, and resulted in death sentences for many of the Nazi elite. Despite criticism of these trials, the IMT itself helped lead to the establishment of the International Criminal Court. One relatively positive outcome of the Second World War was the establishment of the United Nations on October 24, 1945, in order to maintain peace, enforce international laws, and protect human rights. In addition, a number of laws were established in the years after World War II that were direct results of the Nazi threat, including rulings against genocide and in favor of human rights. In terms of the workforce, the presence of women was another effect directly attributed to World War II. Public attitudes also changed, especially towards overt racism. Though it did not completely disappear, tolerance slowly became more widespread. Due to these many consequences, World War II proved to be the most transformative war in history.
Um, so over here we have a little bit on why the Cold War began and a timeline and all that good stuff. So why did the Cold War begin? Uh, USSR's fear of American A-bomb, their fear or their dislike of capitalism, and actions in the Soviet zone of Germany, America's refusal to share nuclear secrets, USSR's expansion into Eastern Europe, broken election promises, fear of an American attack, and USSR's aim of spreading communism. Um, so, um, the war was the geopolitical, ideological, and economic struggle between two world superpowers, the USA and the USSR. That started in 1947 at the end of the Second World War and lasted until the dissolution of the Soviet Union on December 26, 1991. So, while World War II was raging on, America had found themselves allies with the Soviet Union, but before they had a rocky relationship at best. So, Americans had been distrustful of Soviet communism and their leader, Joseph Stalin, who was a sort of like cool and callous man, who will show that many times in his rule. Um, so the Soviets will be offended by Americans' refusal to treat the USSR as the legit part of the international community. They were also mad about America's delayed entry into the war, which ended up costing millions of Russian lives. Uh, so the feeling of suspicion will lead to mutual distrust, and this is going to further fuel the war. Uh, One thing that further fueled the fire of the Cold War was Churchill's Iron Curtain speech. The speech will take place on March 5th, 1946, and would include several anti-communist comments. Stalin will begin to conquer Eastern Europe. The Americans will combat this with the Marshall Plan, which is a program by which the United States gave large amounts of aid to European countries to help them rebuild after the devastation of World War II. It was proposed by the United States Secretary of State. The Russians will put the Zandov Doctrine into play, which was a cultural policy of the Soviet Union during the Cold War period following World War II, calling for stricter government control of art and promoting an extreme anti-Western bias.